Guess we'll get started here, right? It's the clock back there. I hope it's right because I'm going by that clock. I've got 20 seconds before I officially begin. But hey, this is our normal crowd, right? Right. That's good. That's great. I love it. It's good. It is good. I know that a lot of people complain about empty seats, but me and my father had a conversation before all that stuff happened up at his house, and we were talking about. I said, Dad, what do you think's better, an orchard or a grain field? Because you put the same amount of work into both of them, starting them, but what bears more fruit, right? Because you only harvest a grain field once, but an orchard keeps producing. So if you can build a community that has deep roots, then what do you have? Ever-bearing trees, right? So, I mean, I love our small church, right? I love you guys. It's great. It's great. And I think if the audience was more full, I'd be more skittish to get up here. So I love you guys. Thanks for coming and listening to me. Happy Sunday, everybody. Happy Sunday. It's great, right? Life is great. So congratulations. We've all made it through 9 chapters of Romans together, right? Together. And just to recap, because we can lose the, in studies that are that intense, you can lose the overall. You lose the big picture. So in Romans chapter 1, he kind of lays it out, like here's what people have done. Everybody has traded their identity in God for something that was less than God. And because they did that, they became the most unnatural things in all of creation. Because they traded their identity for the created things, they became less than the created things. Okay, so he makes that argument in chapter 1. And then in chapter 2, he says, hey, you guys over here, you think you're doing so well because you got the rules, right? Wrong. Because you had the rules, how much worse is it for you that you've traded your identity for the same thing that those people have traded their identity for? And then what's really beautiful about Romans, when you do that study, and you look at it, is that he starts it out with a greeting. He says, hey, brothers and sisters, how is everybody doing? I've longed to see you. And then he begins to what? He starts dividing up everybody into fragmentations and pieces. And then he starts in 4, 5, and 6, he starts to bring everybody together underneath the sacrifice that has brought us all together into one family. That's why he says he cries out. That's why we can all cry out, Abba, Father. Even creation itself cries out because it's under bad management. And in chapter 7, the gears start to change, and he starts talking about how the community that we live in, how righteousness, that we need to be righteous, like God is righteous. But we've all fallen short of that righteousness. And then 8 and 9, he moves on, and he's going to start steering the conversation from out here to what these people are doing to in here to what we're doing, right? That's the beauty of the overall book of Romans, is that he takes all these examples of division, and then he brings them in closer and closer and closer into our perspective where we can see them and we can focus on the things maybe where we're failing in our own lives or the things that we're doing wrong. But he's already mentioned once before we read through half of chapter 10, he's already mentioned once that he wants nothing more than his brothers and sisters by birth, right, the Jewish people, to accept Christ and be part of this family that's growing. And in the last chapter, he used this beautiful example of Hosea, and I already grilled you guys on that, didn't I, about Hosea. But if you remember, the promise that God made to Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars, right? And we kind of stop right there, but it's not a stop because they were supposed to be a blessing to all the nations of the world, right? They were supposed to be God's priesthood to the entire world, and they fell short of that goal. So in the book of Hosea, if you guys did your homework, in chapter 12, God draws this beautiful metaphor of a tree. He talks about his son, his children being like a tree, and the branches of that tree going out and spreading out all over the world, and the roots going deep into the ground. And when you think about that metaphor, it's not the only place that it's used, because Jesus talks about a mustard seed, right? It's a little tiny thing that grows up, and then all the birds of the air come and take shelter in its wings. And you think about the current world that we live in, right? Think about the world that we live in. Anytime there's a disaster in anywhere, pick a place, a country, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the ocean, a little tiny island gets hit by a tsunami. Who are the first people to show up to help those people? Right. God's people. Those are his children. And when you think about it, the tree has spread, right? And a lot of people don't notice it, but you don't see a whole lot of atheist groups gathering charities, right? You don't see them doing that. But they're still protected under the umbrella. And the more they attack the tree, the less shade it provides, the less cover it provides. So when you look at Hosea and you see this metaphor where God is longing for this relationship with his people and who they're supposed to be, you got to ask yourself the question, right? Like, who am I providing shade for? Who am I covering? Is the fruit that we're bearing? You start asking those questions to yourself. And that's where it leads us into chapter 10, okay? Because Paul, right, this is just Adam's interpretation. I'm thinking, as Paul is sitting here and he's writing this letter out, and he's going through Isaiah and Hosea, and he's thinking about these metaphors that God is, and he's thinking about the church is in Rome, it's in Asia, it's in Jerusalem, it's in Africa, and this is in Paul's day, right? Could you imagine, like, if he was to see the church right now and be like, wow, it's amazing to him. Like, we look around and we see, like, just a few seats, right? How many churches are there in Danbridge? There's a lot, right? How many people say that Jesus is the only way? Salvation. You know that there's Christians in Afghanistan. That blew my mind when I heard that. Because that country, they don't have TV, they don't have radio, they don't have any of that stuff. None of the stuff, they didn't see Billy Graham on Sunday, right? They're not going to see this on YouTube. But somehow, there's parts of the branch that are over there in Afghanistan right now. And I pray for them, right? Because it's getting really hard for those people. And there's branches in North Korea and China. Some of the most dangerous places to be a Christian is where the church thrives the most. So like the more they try to cut at those branches, the stronger the tree gets. Amen? That's awesome, right? Our God is awesome. So when Paul's thinking about these metaphors and he's writing this stuff down, the beauty of it is chapter 10, right? Because he starts thinking about where he came from. And you're going to see that Paul is exhibiting that compassion trait that God told Moses that he was on top of the mountain. Okay, so without further ado, I don't want to talk over Paul too much, right? I don't want to talk over Paul too much, but without further ado, chapter 10, and you'll hear it. You'll hear Paul as his desire and what he sees should happen, because these people, their unfaith, they thought that work could get them there, and they've stumbled on that because they don't see their relationship to God as a family relationship. It's a work-based relationship. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. For Moses writes about the righteousness that is based on the law. That is, the person who does the commandments shall live by them. But the righteousness based on faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend to heaven? That is to bring Christ down. Or who will descend into the abyss? That is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith that we proclaim. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. For the scripture says, everyone who believes in him will not be put to shame. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? So faith comes by hearing, and hearing through the words of Christ. But I asked, have they not heard? Indeed they have. For the voice has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. But I ask, did Israel not understand? First, Moses says, I will make you jealous of those whom are not a nation. With a foolish nation I will make you angry. Then Isaiah is so bold as to say, I have been found by those who did not seek me. I have shown myself to those who did not ask for me. And then I'll stop right there, because he's going to flip the argument. Okay, so that's a lot to go through. It is a lot, trust me, it's a lot. Really heavy, because here's another one of those verses that people take, right? I'm going to roll up my sleeves for this one. Here's another one of those verses that people take completely out of context, right? There's two of them in here. You guys know those verses? Anyone want to take a stab at those two verses? If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And people think that that's the ultimate salvation right there. I mean, I love Billy Graham. That's what he taught. That's basically what he stuck to. His line was that right there. And what we do with that, a lot of times is we take it completely out of context, right? We take stuff out of context. It's all right. Step outside of ourselves and look at what Paul is trying to say to us. So I'll back up to verse 1 here, because he addresses this chapter. He's about to start making an argument about what it is to be saved. That's what he's going to do. So he says, brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God is for them, is that they may be saved. Okay, see how he opens? And who's he talking about, they? It's the Jews in the synagogue who are trying to cause division in the church, right? Remember the group that he's talking to. He's got Jewish brothers and sisters, right? Gentiles, and then barbarian heathens, right? Sitting in the church. That was commonplace then. Because people would say, well, what's this all about, right? I hear they give out free meals, right? Then they just show up to church. That happens a lot, right? Like, you don't know. Somebody will just come up to church, you don't know who they are. They're like, yeah, I need gas money and a free meal, right? And they show up, and what do? We take care of them, okay? Because that's who we are. So you have these three different groups of people, and Paul has wrestled with this through Corinthians, through Ephesians. He's wrestled with this division over and over again, because what happens is these early churches were born out of synagogues, right? Because where did Paul go? You go to the book of Acts, and the first place Paul would go to make his argument was to the synagogue, right? Because those people should be the first to understand the things that he's talking about. Think about all the references he makes. Isaiah, Hosea, right? It would be like me making references to Confucius, to you guys, if I was just to take that message to Gentiles, right? It would be like me making references to 18th century philosophers, right? How many of you know any 18th century philosophers? It would be crazy, okay? So the first place that they would go was the synagogue, and guess what? Most of the time, Paul ended up, bloodied outside of the street because that's how they would accept him, okay? So imagine that. Paul, in the position that he was in, think about Paul's life. The position that he was in before was like an enforcer for the law. He was a Pharisee. He was an enforcer. So these Christians running around, he was the one who was going around and trying to find them, right? Do you think Jesus is Messiah? Yeah. And then he'd hit him with a club and drag him off to jail, right? Or drag him before the tribunal or whatever synagogue was in town. He was the guy who was doing the active persecution. God calls him into the picture, and now he's the one who's not running from the synagogue or the people coming out of the synagogues. He's running to them and taking his beating there, okay? And I think Paul, a lot of times, he would have to think that it's kind of funny that he was the one that was doing and then that's why he was so willing to go take it, But anyway, here's his desires for them, because, what does he say? Verse 2, he says, "For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God." Okay? Now, if some stranger just showed up here, and it's happened before, and they started yelling crazy rhetoric about whatever, right? Just pick something heretical, and, they're crazy. And we think that they're crazy. And they enter into our church, and our first response is to go and attack that person, right? That's what we think. That's what we do. That's what we think that's an outside influence coming in to attack the flock. But Paul's the guy on the outside coming in, and he's the one praying for the people who are pushing him out. Where do you think he got that from? Jesus, right? Because as Jesus is hanging on the cross, what does he say? "Father, forgive them, because they know not what they do." It's a good thing our God is persistent, right? Because we would have never got it. We would have never understood it. We would have never understood what that sacrifice was worth, the value of it, and what it made us into, and is making us into. So he's bearing witness of their zeal, because, he was the guy, and the moment he says something that kind of rubs them the wrong way, guess what they're willing to do? Whatever it takes, we got to get him out of here, because God tells us that we're supposed to, right? But that's what they think. They think that God tells us to get that person out of here, and they forget certain parts of the Bible, right? They know what they've been taught. But they forget the part where Jeremiah says, God says it to Jeremiah, and he says, I don't desire the blood of bulls, I desire what? Mercy. Forget those parts, because those parts are the hard parts to do, aren't they? It's hard to sit and listen to a crazy person tell you something that is just crazy to you. That's the hard thing to do. The easy thing to do is just push that person out and not try to live in right relationship or find some common ground and live with that person. Those are the easy things to do. Or that's the hard thing to do. The easy thing to do is just push all those people out. I always say that leads you to what I call pickup truck theology, where it's just you, your Bible, and Jesus, right? But, he's not really there with you, because there's always a crowd that gathers around him. Okay, so he says they have the zeal for God, but not according to knowledge, for being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. Now that is a mouthful. He says righteousness how many times in that sentence? Twice. So here's the thing. They have a zeal for God, but they just know a little bit. It's not for knowledge that they have this zeal. It's for something else. And so they're not It's not knowledge. It's not knowledge that they're getting. In the Greek, it's wisdom, right? And it's translated in mine a little bit different. You may have wisdom in yours. If you have the New King James, I think it's translated as wisdom. The Old King James is, I'm drawing a blank. What do you guys have? Someone have the Old King James? Of knowledge? Ignorant, yes. It uses, yeah, they use the term ignorant. But it's without knowledge. The term in Greek is used as like no wisdom, right? No wisdom, unwise. Unwisely, they looked at. So without knowledge or ignorant, you could say that. So he says, for being ignorant of the righteousness of God, they seek to establish their own. Okay, so here's the beauty of what he's just saying in that sentence. Okay, these people, lacking knowledge, sought to establish a relationship without knowing the person they were establishing the relationship with. That makes sense? Then they were trying to establish their own righteousness based on what they thought God wanted rather than what God had done. Okay, because you can just go through the Bible. Hindsight is always 20/20. Okay, I don't want to cast too much judgment on these people. Paul didn't want to either. Okay, this chapter proves it. But hindsight is 20/20. When we look back through the Bible, we can see how merciful God was because he had all these children in the desert, and every turn, what did they do? They rebelled and complained. Rebelled and complained. How patient was God with them? I mean, an entire generation of rebelling and complaining, and God is with them the whole time. I mean, at one point, God wants to give up, but I think that's kind of to draw Moses' compassion out. Because if you look at the story, God's like, let's just give up. We'll start over with you, Moses. And Moses is like, nope, you can't. Because if you're going to wipe them out, you got to wipe me out too. And then God's like, good. Now I'll show you who I am, right? That's one of those father-son moments where you're like, you take him out fishing and you've taught him how to bait the hook, but this is the time where you're like, oh, no, I forgot the bait. And it's like son pulls the bait out of the box, right? And you're like, good job. It was just a test, right? To see if you had learned anything from Dad in the first place. So in that moment, Moses, he passes the test because he's willing to lay his own life down for these people, okay? And we look back at that and we say, oh yeah, well, Jesus did that. But these people look back at that and they go, no, 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 no. See, it was because Moses followed all the rules. Right? You could even argue with an Orthodox Jew today and have the same argument. Say, well, Jesus is revealed through the relationship. God's righteousness was revealed through his relationship with Moses. Because look how patient he was with Moses. Like in the very beginning with Moses, it's like, Moses, I need you to come do something for me. No, 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 I'm not that good at talking. Moses, I need you to come do something for me. No, well, what's my brother doing? Moses, I need you. He keeps doing that. And God's like, all right, now you're going to do it. Okay? Dad puts his foot down and he says, you're going to do it, Moses. Because we look at it now as a relationship to our Father, as God to our Father. To the Jews, back then, God was the way people think that we think that God is. Okay? And a lot of it involves a lot of correction. Because a lot of people think that God is some giant cosmic killjoy who's up there just, sending lightning bolts down and getting rid of bad people, right? But I hope that's not how you perceive God, right? I hope that's not how you see him. The way we see him, he's already said it. Paul's already said it. We call him Abba, Father, right? And the way they see him is Job chapter 1. Okay? You see the difference? Job chapter 1 is like an infant, or let's say a 10-year-old, looking at his father, and his father is the giant who just bears judgment. Okay? 10-year-old looks at his dad, and he sees the giant who bears judgment. The 20-year-old looks at his dad, and he sees the guy who cares about me, the guy who pushed me through things that I thought I couldn't get through. right? Your maturity level and perspective are everything. See, because you could be a 10-year-old and love your dad and do all kinds of things in your dad's name and they'd be wrong. You know what? You could do that and be ignorant, completely ignorant of who your dad is, really. Your dad's always off at work. Or all you have is your perspective of who your dad is. Okay? Without Jesus, we never had any perspective of who God really was. Because in the Old Testament, you have to read underneath all those things to see the relationship that God is trying, desperately trying, to establish with his people. Just like in the book of Hosea and Isaiah. The two prophets that he's already mentioned, God is trying to establish this relationship with his people. And every time, they just keep running away. It's like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Don't you know I care about you? Yet you keep running away from me? So he says they tried to establish their own righteousness. They didn't submit to God's righteousness. Because what is it that we do? We think that we have things right. Paul's already gone through this too. He's bringing multiple arguments together. We think that we're the ones who are right in the story all the time. Right? It's like, I'll be the first guy to raise my hand on that one. Because I think I'm the one who's right in the story all the time. My relationship is based on how right I am in thinking I'm getting you the things that you need. Okay? I think about my relationship with my wife. Okay? And I say this a few times. Well, I've said it a few times. But my relationship with my wife is a lot like my relationship with God. Sometimes my wife wants flowers, and I don't know that she wants flowers, and she never tells me she wants flowers. But I don't get her flowers, and then I come home, and she gives me that disappointed look on her face. And I see you guys smiling, right? You guys know what that's like, right? It's like, well, it was our anniversary, and you didn't give me flowers. Well, last anniversary, you said you didn't care if I got you flowers. Well, I didn't really mean that. And it's like, you can't win for losing, right? Right, guys? But ladies, it's okay, because our relationship with God is exactly the same way, okay? And I'm just trying to break down what Paul's trying to say by building our own righteousness rather than submitting to God's righteousness, okay? I'm not trying to bash on ladies. I love you ladies. You guys are great. You're excellent supporters, right? I love you. You're built completely opposite of the way that we are, and God built you, so that makes you beautiful. We were just formed to hold stuff, right? You guys were built, carefully and meticulously built. So with that said, okay, now I think I've earned some license to say some things. So, okay, I'm getting that look from the ladies. Phew, it's getting hot up here, all right? But anyway, so you guys know what that's like. You have this expectation that the thing that you're going to bring home is going to be the exact thing that they want, right? And then they get it, and they give you that little half smile. Oh, that was sweet of you. And you're like, oh no, what did I do wrong? Did I not take out the garbage? Did I not do this? Did I not do that? What have I done to disappoint her? We've done that, right? Like you've seen that look of subtle disappointment, and you're just like, what have I done wrong? What have I done wrong? What is it? And they'll never tell you, right? They never tell you. That's us trying to build our own righteousness, right? Rather than actually surprise them. There's been a few times, like my wife, okay, I found this for you guys out there if you need a little pointer, right? Which I'm sure you don't. You've been married a lot longer than I have, and I probably need a lot more pointers than I, right? Than I can give you. But me and my wife went on this long hiking thing a couple of years ago. And we were like primitive camping. I don't know, they have a special name for it. But we have a tent, and we'd find a spot, and we'd sleep. We'd go out, we went to the Blue Ridge Parkway, and we just roughed it. No shower for like 4 or 5 days. I thought she was going to be miserable the whole time. She loved it. I was totally shocked. But on the last day we were camping, we were foraging for most of our food, and she didn't know I knew how to forage. Coming from the great state of Montana, that's one of the things we learn in elementary school is how to forage for food if you're caught out in crazy weather conditions. So I'm foraging for food, and I make this entire meal with dandelion greens, trout, and I make this entire meal, an entire meal. And I have never seen her happier in my life. And I didn't know. I didn't even know that would make her happy. And then I asked her about it. And you know what she said? She said, you went out and you found all this stuff for me, and I realized how much work it took for you to do that. See, because she doesn't see, my wife doesn't see, when I go to work and work 10, 14-hour days or nights, all night long, sundown to sunrise, right? She doesn't see what I'm doing in order to put the food on the table in the first place. She doesn't understand that part, right? And that's not me trying to establish a relationship. That's just my obligation. So when I'm trying to build my own righteousness, it's like I feel like I'm obliged to do it. But when she sees me go out of my way, because I could have just got dandelions or I could have just got the trout, right? But I went and got all the extra stuff. I went out of my way and did all the extra things so that just to please her. And when she realized that, guess what? She was actually pleased. It had nothing to do with the flowers or me remembering a certain day. It had to do more with how much more I am attached to the relationship than I am to the things of the relationship. How far am I willing to go? Okay? So with that said, ladies are smiling at me. That's fine. Guys, pointers, right? Good. Hopefully that'll sink in. I know a lot of times my head is harder. I get stubborn sometimes, and it's a guy thing. You think, well, is that not good enough for you? Then, right? You do that number. Well, I'm just gonna go sit in my shed and do my whatever it is that I do in my shed. Just sit there and just watch the wall, count flowers like the Stradler brothers. But anyway, he moves on. So that's establishing your own righteousness is a lot like bringing home flowers when nobody wants flowers. It's just, come on, it's silly. You're trying to work your way into a good relationship. You can't do that. See, the story I told you had nothing to do with the stuff that I brought. It had everything to do with my intention of bringing stuff. Right? So God's righteousness, Paul's already established what's God's righteousness. That he sent his only son to die on behalf of who? Right? Us. That's good news. That's good news because through his sacrifice, we've been adopted into his family. So we can call on God as our Father. Now, do you think that because you give more, or because you did this, or because you did that, that improves your relationship with God? None. It doesn't. Do you think God wants the blood of bulls, or does he desire mercy? Okay? Don't establish your own righteousness. You don't know what God really wants. It's the intent. He wants the intention, the desire of your heart, right? Because my desire to please my wife was that high, she took it as my desire. She understood that it had nothing to do with these things. Nothing to do. I mean, we're primitive camping. We don't have electricity or anything. And we have nothing except for a tent and a little pot to cook the trout in. But the intention behind it was what brought everything together. So he says, they didn't submit, for Christ is the end of law for righteousness to everyone who believes. And now this is one of those sentences, okay, or verses, however you want to put it. I just put them as sentences. It's one of those verses where people say, see, Jesus just destroyed the law. And you could go way off in this direction, or you could go way off in this direction. Jesus destroyed the law. No, he didn't, right? You could have that argument and be torn in half by it. But I think the truth lies in the middle. Because Jesus is the end of the law for righteousness. Okay, that's what he says. Listen carefully. the end of the law for righteousness. You do not gain right relationship with God by following rules that he established for someone else. Okay? Okay. You don't get right relationship with God, and I hope what do they call them? I can't remember what they call them. But you do not get right relationship with God by following someone else's rules. If he made rules for somebody else a long time ago, you don't get to be adopted into the family by that. That's not by the means. And I'll give you just a little example of that. If one of my son's friends came over to the house, and I have a chores list on the wall, one of my son's friends came over, and he does all my son's chores on the list. Does that make my son's friend my son? No, it doesn't. It does not. It never will. It can't happen. It doesn't matter how many rules you follow. The only way we are adopted into God's family, to be part of that tree that spreads out over the globe and blesses all the nations, no matter how bad that they are, is through Christ, through his blood. That's the only way. Because we weren't given those rules, were we? So our righteousness, the righteousness that we have, the right relationship that we have, depends on something someone else did for us. It makes us completely dependent on Jesus. And that's a good place to be. That's good news. That's good news. Because what can separate us? The only thing that could separate us from the love of God would be Jesus cutting us off. And of how many of his disciples did he ever cut off? You remember Peter. What did he do? Denied him 3 times. You think Judas' betrayal was worse than Peter's? I don't think so. Who did Jesus deny? Anyone? Did anyone come to Jesus and he was like, nope, you got to go away? He would say things, right? Like, you have to make a choice right here, right now. I got to go bury my dad. Well, let the dead bury their own. Or he would say, there's one thing that you need to do. Sell all your stuff. Give it to the poor. He would give them things that they needed to do, but he never turned anyone away. Never. And once you were part of his family, guess what? You can't leave. There's no getting de-adopted. If I was to adopt a child into my family, if I was to adopt a kid into my family, I don't know if anyone's raised children that were adopted, but a lot of times you get kids that are been hurt by the world, right? Hurt. Really bad hurt. And the only way to overcome that hurt is not by hurting them more, it's by loving them to the end of yourself, to the end of who you are. I haven't been challenged with that yet, but I mean, maybe that could be. I could be telling you a story about how this kid or that kid did this and how it frustrated me. But even those adopted kids, they make you angry, right? At first, they're super excited about being adopted, but then all this stuff from their past starts to come up. And guess what? Adopted dad has to deal with, or foster dad. You have to deal with the stuff from their past. And think about how God deals with us. We get adopted into the family. We get all this baggage we bring with us. And then what does he do? Let's start dealing with it. How do we deal with it? Well, in the first place, we know that God loves us. And he only disciplines who? The ones he loves. So when we get disciplined by God, that's a good thing, right? Because you're trying to work something out of me that I didn't even know was there. So Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. So if you're born into God's house, and God being dad, right? You're born into his house, and you don't follow his rules, you do everything the wrong way, does dad have the right to kick you out of his house and to send you on your way? Say, hey, you know what? Maybe the military is the best thing for you to give you some discipline right now, right? I heard that one, right? I heard that one. Or maybe you just need to find a new direction in your life, but I'm done with you. We do that number right there. That happens a lot. It happens a lot. Do you think God, in the context of being dad, has the right to kick people out of his house, even if they're his children? Absolutely. Do you think he still loves them, even though he had to kick them out of his house? Absolutely. Right? Like my dad, I thought he hated me for the longest time because I was an exemplary teenager. And being exemplary, I mean, I was really good at being bad, right? So I thought my dad hated me for the longest time, as hard as he was on me, and as hard as he pushed me. But guess what? He didn't hate me, right? He didn't. When I came back home, it was like the prodigal son returns. I was shocked. So you think about that. Even sons who are adopted into a household, fathers come to love them as their own sons. That's how they see them. Jesus is just the kid who brought us into the house. Okay? And that means that my righteousness could never be established by some rules that I can follow. And that is great news, because I was never really good at following those rules in the first place. And so it got me in this mess. But as long as Dad's got his hand around mine, guess what? There's something more important than the rules. And then the rules don't become rules. They become life. Do you guys get that? Rules don't become rules. They don't become laws. They become, I care about my dad, so I'm going to do this for him. Because our relationship isn't based on rules. Now that I know that our relationship is not based on rules, guess what? I'm free to follow him without rebellion. Because now, my dad, I do it because I care about my dad. And the only reason he gave me those rules in the first place was because he cares about me. Now that I know that he loves me, guess what? All those things that he said before make sense. Rules without love will always lead to rebellion. That's true as it was then as it was in the garden. So he says, for Moses writes about the righteousness that is based on the law, that the person who does the commandments shall live by them. But the righteousness based on faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven. Okay, so here he's getting kind of complicated. Okay, he's going to get kind of complicated. He says, who will ascend into heaven? That is to bring Christ down. Or who will descend into the abyss? That is to bring Christ up from the dead. So what he's starting to do is he's starting to talk about how we judge each other. If we're one family, and our righteousness is not based on the rules that we follow, rather the one who we follow, if our righteousness is based on him, then how is it that we could say, who gets to go to heaven? How could we ever say that? We don't have any right? We don't have any righteousness of our own. You see how that works? We don't have any righteousness of our own. We're using his. So remember the group of people that he's talking to. Barbarians, Gentiles, and Jews. What do you think the Jews are talking about all the time amongst themselves? Those people over there, you know the stuff that they do? God says don't do that. Remember, God is still an arbitrary figure up in the sky to them. And the Gentiles probably sitting there going, you know what? That guy, he's a pretty good guy. That guy's going straight up there, right? He's going straight up. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Go straight to heaven. And the whole time they're casting judgment on each other, and guess what they're doing? They're dividing each other up. They're cutting the group into pieces. They're cutting the body of Christ up. And who do they have the right to do that? Because I don't have any righteousness of my own. God is the only righteous judge. That's what Paul has already said. If God is the only righteous judge, then those barbarians who are sitting over there, they may be doing terrible stuff, and they may still be going to the temple of Zeus, but I know their dad. And Dad's going to deal with what they're doing. And I'm just going to tell him, I'm going to say, you know what, you probably shouldn't do that because Dad punishes the kids that he loves. And if you keep doing that, guess what? Dad's going to get mad. And he's going to straighten out your behavior real quick. That's the approach that we should take when we're trying to correct each other's behavior. Right? It's not the approach of, hey, you know what? Those people over there start rumoring and start talking. That'll tear a church apart like you wouldn't believe. That will destroy a church. One of the things that Paul, James, John, all of them, the one thing that gets them all upset, remember, these guys are early church founders. They followed Jesus. They followed him around. The one thing that gets them madder than anything else is what? It's that G word. We all try to mask in righteousness, don't we? It's that gossip word, isn't it? We talk about other people. They all talk about it. They're like gossip. Gossip's right up there with adultery, you know, in John's eyes. He's like gossip, slander, adultery. He names gossip first, actually. That's the first one he names. So it's like way up there. Because what are you doing when you're gossiping? You're attacking your brothers and sisters. And we try to mask it in those things, don't we? We try to do that stuff where we say, I don't know why we went this direction, but we try to mask it in those things that it seems like we're being righteous with those people, right? Like we try to mask gossip. Like we'll say stuff like, did you know? Oh, we need to pray for them, right? Have you ever heard? I mean, I've heard it before in other churches. I'm not accusing anybody of anything, right? Conviction comes from the Holy Spirit, not from me. But they'll try to mask gossip in something like, hey, did you hear that their son did X, Y, and Z? We need to really pray for them, right? And then they think, all of a sudden, what is it that person is doing in that moment? They're masking their gossip, but what are they trying to establish at the same time? Their own righteousness. Because what is it? We need to pray for that person. Because I'm really concerned. I really care. It's like, no, you don't. Because you would go straight to that person. You wouldn't go to everybody else, right? Because when you go to everybody else, what you're seeking is approval from those other people. You're not seeking to actually, do you think God goes around? Okay. All right. So you think God would go, if Jesus showed up to church, do you think he would go and he'd say, you know what, Timmy in the corner, he really needs everyone else to pray for him? Do you think Jesus would ever do that? If let's say Timmy has a problem with something. It doesn't matter, it's arbitrary. I'm using an arbitrary example. Say Timmy has a problem with something. You think Jesus would show up and just be like, hey, you know what, everybody? We need to, pray for Timmy because he's in trouble. And these are his problems. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. He could go down. I could put myself in that seat, right? I could put myself in that seat, and he could walk into the room. Do you think he would ever do that? No. He never did. People come up to him with problems. I'm unclean. If you're willing, you can make me clean. All right, I'm willing. You're clean. You didn't have to announce it to everybody, right? Guess what that guy did? He ended up following Jesus. Do you think he told all the other disciples? He's sitting there going, hey, Peter, he's going to deny me 3 times. So every time he gives you a hard time, just tell him, right? Every time. Jesus never did anything like that. Why? Because it's the worst thing that we can do to each other. Because in the act of gossip, what we actually do is we defile the image of God. You can think of it one of 2 ways. You can think of it either you're cutting the body of Christ into little tiny pieces and segmenting them and casting them out, or you're actually spray painting God himself. Because who was it that invited that person into the church in the first place? And if my righteousness is not based on the things that I do, but rather the things that he did, whose righteousness am I trying to establish in saying or doing those things? It's my own. So when Paul says this, he's compounding on the argument he's already made about righteousness based on faith. And when he says, do not say in your heart who will ascend to heaven. right? Because he's already made the argument that some people, well, they're meant as vessels for destruction, and some people are meant for vessels of glory, right? To carry God's glory, and some are meant to, not. But what we are not supposed to do is judge which ones are which. Because we're not righteous judges. I don't care if there's anyone in this room who is. Go ahead, stand up. Because you got competition, right? I'm the only one who is the righteous judge. The one who called us all in here. Because before we came here, what were we? Vessels meant for destruction. If I continued in my ways, guess where I would be? It wouldn't be good. I'd be in one of those forever boxes, right? So Paul, he's going into this, and you can feel the shift almost, because he talks about his brothers and sisters who are Jews and how his desire is that they'd be saved. After they've beaten him up and thrown him out of every synagogue in Asia Minor, right? I mean, Paul was a popular guy, and when I say popular, I mean infamous, right? He goes down to Jerusalem, and he's probably in shackles right now as he's writing this, in the bottom of a boat, maybe. I don't know. He doesn't dictate what time it happened. He goes back to Jerusalem, and they're like, hey, if you go down and you pay for those guys to try to make the synagogue happy, they're going to throw you in prison, and you're going to die in Rome, Paul. Right? That's what the prophetesses said to him. And he's like, okay. And he just goes on his merry way, doesn't he? Because it's like, well, all right, he's already figured it out. I mean, how much more does he have to grow? So he's moving on, and he says, so who will ascend into heaven, or who will descend into the abyss? Don't. Just don't. Don't waste your life trying to figure those things out. Because guess what? It's hard enough just to follow Jesus in the first place, isn't it? That's what a lot of times that we spend too much time doing. We say, oh, man, I heard he voted for this candidate, right? He's definitely not one of us. Pick something. Pick anything. I heard that he wears Nike shoes. There's a million ways we can divide each other into little different groups, but only one that would unite all of us together. You guys know that one? Because that's the only one that's going to keep us together. So he says, but what does it say? If you notice all the questions Paul asks, do you know where he gets all those questions from? I just asked another question, didn't I? That reminds me, there's a joke about some students. I told the joke already. But what does he say? But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith that we proclaim. Okay? So here's the setup. Here's the setup to it. He is trying to show us how to live righteously by putting himself out there and saying, the very people that beat me, that I have every right to be angry at, those are the people I pray for the most. That's how he starts. And then what does he move to? He said, because you know what? They thought they were doing the right thing, but they're not. It's just exactly the same thing as they crucified Jesus. And he says, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The very same thing. And he says, look, our righteousness is not based on the things that we do. It's not based on work. We can't earn our way into being a son of the Most High. We can't do it. It's just not possible. You don't get adopted into the family and then think you can work your way to the top. It's good enough being called son of God or daughter of God. When he looks at you, he loves you. And you know who you are because you're his and he is yours. There's no greater love than that. He says the word is in you, the word we proclaim. Because what is the word that we proclaim? Well, Jesus is the only way. I can't attain salvation. I can't attain righteousness. Everything that I've tried to put on myself to make me look like a better person, all the times I've said, hey, look at how good of a person I am. because I said this or because I did that. All that is dirty. Because the only reason I did it in the first place was to gain acceptance from other people, when there was only one that I needed acceptance from in the first place. So he moves on and he says, but if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. Right? We take that out of context and we make that a whole theological treatise. We take those two verses and we make that a whole theological treatise. But the thing is, Paul began that with his compassion for his brothers and sisters. And then he said, because in effect what he's saying, whenever you say who's going to go to heaven and who's going to go to the abyss, in effect what you're doing is stepping on the same stumbling stone that they fell on in the first place. Our own judgment. Where did we mess up in the Garden of Eden? We seized autonomy from God. And we became vulnerable and afraid. And because we became vulnerable and afraid, we had to impress the people around us so that they would accept us. Because if we got more people around us, we'd be safe. But the reality is that every one of us is vulnerable. And there's a whole world full of people that are vulnerable. People that don't know if everyone else, these people are going to like me for the shoes I'm wearing, or if I'm doing the right kind of prayers, or if I'm spreading the right kind of, if I'm saying the right kind of things, or doing the right kind of things. See, all that, every relationship you have with another human being, we always try to base it on the things that we do, right? Like I brought you an apple pie. That means that you should like me more, right? Or I did this, and that means you should like me more. Because human beings, we're all one-dimensional. But God is three-dimensional. The moment you're adopted into his family, he loves you for who you are, for who you were, and the person you will be. And he's there with you every step of the way. That's what it means to have this word in your heart and confess that he's Lord. Like we just say, you know, like we walk up to somebody, is Jesus Lord of your life? And they're like, sure. But that's so shallow, isn't it? Because we don't actually spend the time to think about it. If Jesus was the Lord of your life, what's the most important thing to you? It's my relationship with God. Can I earn that? No. Paul just said I couldn't. And what's the most important thing to me is my relationship with God. And every time I mess up, and I know I broke one of Dad's rules. Dad, I looked at that person the wrong way. Dad, why do I not like the president? You know, whatever it is. And this is going out on YouTube, and, you know, I'm probably going to get doxxed for it, but I live over there on Ailey Road, so come on over, right, anytime. But the relationships, we think, and when we think in relationships, we always get all these things all messed up, and we don't look to Jesus first, right? Because what did he do for me? What was God willing to give for me? Everything. So in order for me to establish relationships with other people that aren't based on the things that I do, what am I willing to give? Jesus is the Lord of my life. That's a hard pill to swallow. Especially when I look at my kids. Well, it's easy when I look at my kids, because what would I give for them? Everything, right? That's easy. That's expected of us. That's an obligation we have. What about strangers? You know, when you start to move outside of your circle, or the crazy guy who comes in, to bring it back full circle, the crazy guy who comes in who has all the wrong ideas. Is it push him out or bring him in? Because what would Jesus do? And what's our relationship really based on? And who is it that we're actually trying to impress?